There is a kind of quiet that only exists in rooms where people are afraid to breathe too loudly. Mara Voss stepped into that quiet at 9 in the morning, holding a folder she had rewritten 4 times the night before, and understood within 3 seconds that everyone in the waiting area was holding their breath the same way she was. Kessler Logistics occupied the top 2 floors of a building that used to be a fish cannery. You could still smell it in the walls if the heating came on too fast: salt, rust, something that never fully left. Mara had told herself on the walkover that this was just a job. Numbers. Ledgers. Nothing more than columns that needed to add up correctly. She had told herself that the man she was about to meet was, underneath the stories, just another employer who happened to frighten people for a living. She did not entirely believe herself. But belief was a luxury, and her brother's hospital bills were not. The assistant who called her name did not make eye contact. That, more than anything, told her what kind of building this was. People who worked in normal offices looked at each other. People who worked here had learned not to. Nikolai Kessler's office looked out over the harbor, gray water meeting a grayer sky, and he did not stand when she entered. He did not need to. There was something about the stillness of him, broad shoulders held motionless, hands flat on the desk, that made standing unnecessary. Power, Mara realized, was not always loud. Sometimes it was simply the certainty that no one in the room would ever ask you to be smaller. "You're late," he said, without looking up from the folder in front of him. "I'm 4 minutes early," Mara said. The silence that followed had weight to it. She watched the assistant near the door go very still, the way a rabbit goes still when it hears something move in the grass. Nikolai looked up then, and his eyes, she had expected them to be cold, and they were, but underneath the cold there was something closer to surprise, as if very few people corrected him and lived long enough to regret it. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He asked her 3 questions about her last job, one about a discrepancy in a spreadsheet she'd caught 2 years ago that had apparently reached him somehow. And then he closed the folder and said the words that would end up changing more than either of them understood that morning. "Most people who sit in that chair spend the whole interview agreeing with me. It's exhausting. I want someone who can find the truth in a set of books and tell me what it is, even when I don't want to hear it. Can you do that?" "I can," Mara said. "But I won't do it if you're going to shout at me every time you don't like the answer." The assistant near the door made a sound like a held breath finally escaping wrong. Nikolai's jaw tightened, the first crack of temper Mara would come to recognize as his opening move, the tell before the storm. For a moment she thought she had lost the job, and worse, she thought she had made an enemy of a man who did not lose interest in his enemies. Instead, he almost smiled. It looked unfamiliar on his face, like a muscle that had gone unused for years. "You start Monday," he said. "Bring the folder. I want to see how you rewrote it 4 times. She had not told him that. By her 3rd week, Mara had learned the rhythms of the building the way sailors learn a coastline, which hallways to avoid at certain hours, which doors stayed closed even when the meetings inside them were finished, which of Nikolai's silences meant thinking and which meant about to detonate. She had not yet learned to predict the second kind, and on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, that lack of warning nearly cost her everything. It started with a shipment manifest that didn't match the numbers in the warehouse log. A small thing. 6 crates, unaccounted for, worth more in absence than most people made in a year. Mara found it because she always cross-checked twice, a habit inherited from a father who had once trusted a business partner's math and lost everything because of it. She brought it to Nikolai's office the way she brought every discrepancy, directly, without softening it, without the practiced flinch she'd seen in every other employee who entered that room. He read the page once. Then again. Then his hand came down flat on the desk, hard enough that the ship's bell sitting beside his monitor gave a single, muffled ring. "Who signed off on this?" he said, and his voice had dropped into a register Mara hadn't heard from him before, low, controlled, and somehow more frightening than shouting would have been. Ilse, standing near the window, went rigid. The assistant who had let Mara in that first morning did not so much leave the room as evaporate from it. "I don't know yet," Mara said. "That's why I brought it to you instead of guessing." "Find out," he said, and now the volume came, all at once, the way a held dam finally gives. "Today. I want a name today, do you understand me? I am not paying you to bring me problems. I am paying you to bring me answers." Mara did not move. She did not flinch, did not look down, did not do the thing she had watched 3 separate employees do in front of her in the past 3 weeks, which was to apologize for a mistake that was not theirs. "If you shout at me one more time," she said, quietly enough that he had to stop to hear it, "I will find your answer just as fast sitting in the hallway as I will sitting in this chair. But I will find it faster if you let me work instead of watching you perform for an audience of 2 people who already know how this ends." The room went silent in a way it had not gone silent before, not the practiced, breath-held silence of fear, but something closer to shock. Ilse's eyes moved from Mara to Nikolai and back, calculating something Mara couldn't yet read. Nikolai himself sat very still, his hand still flat on the desk, the bell beside him settling into stillness. No one, in 11 years of Kessler logistics, had ever told him to stop. Nobody had ever spoken to the Mafia boss like this. The name Mara found 3 days later was not the name anyone had expected, least of all her. She had spent those 3 days doing the only thing she trusted, going backward through the numbers instead of forward, the way her father had taught her before he lost everything to a man who understood ledgers just well enough to hide inside them. 6 crates missing from the manifest turned out to be the visible edge of something larger, a pattern of shipments logged at slightly wrong weights, each discrepancy small enough to pass a glance, consistent enough that no accident could explain it. She did the work at her own desk, not Nikolai's, because she had learned by then that his office made people careless. The fear in the air changed how they held a pen, how fast they signed things. Her father's old ledger sat open beside her laptop the whole time, a habit that made no practical sense and that she kept anyway, running her thumb along its cracked spine when a column of numbers refused to make sense. By Thursday evening, the pattern had a shape. Someone with warehouse-level access was skimming inventory before it ever reached the manifest, and doing it carefully enough to suggest they had studied exactly how closely anyone checked. Only a handful of people had that access. Fewer still had the patience for a scheme this slow. She brought her findings to Nikolai after hours, when the outer office had emptied and the harbor outside his window had gone the color of wet slate. He read the pages in silence this time, no hand slamming the desk, no bell disturbed. Whatever had shifted after Tuesday's confrontation had not undone itself. If anything, he seemed to be watching himself as closely as he watched her. "You're certain," he said. "I'm certain about the pattern. I'm not certain about the name yet. I have 3 people it could be, and I'd rather tell you when I have one than guess out loud and ruin someone who's innocent." Something crossed his face, not quite approval, something quieter than that. "My father would have had all 3 of them in a room by morning." "I'm not your father," Mara said, "and I don't work that way." He didn't answer right away. He looked at her the way a man looks at a door he has never noticed was unlocked. "No," he said finally. "You don't." Petrov found her in the stairwell the next morning, which told her before he said a word that whatever he wanted to say, he did not want it overheard. He was older than everyone else in the building by at least 2 decades, built like a man who had once been dangerous with his hands and had simply never stopped carrying himself that way. He had worked for Nikolai's father. Everyone knew it. Everyone also knew that he had never fully accepted working for the son. "You should learn to be smaller," he said, without preamble, blocking the stairwell just enough that she couldn't pass without asking him to move, and he made it clear, without saying so, that asking would cost her something. "I've heard that before," Mara said. "It's usually said by people who've made themselves small their whole lives and want company." His mouth twitched, something between offense and reluctant respect. "You think what happened Tuesday made you safe? It didn't. It made you visible. There's a difference, and the second one gets people hurt in this building far more often than the first." "Is that a threat?" "It's a mercy," he said. "The old man, Nikolai's father, he built this place on one rule. You do not talk back. Not because he liked being obeyed. Because the men who talked back to him always ended up dead within the year, one way or another, and he wanted people too frightened to end up like them." Nikolai grew up watching that role work. He grew up believing fear is the only thing that keeps people loyal, because it's the only thing that ever kept him alive in that house. Mara said nothing. She thought of the ship's bell on Nikolai's desk, silent, unrung, sitting there like something he couldn't decide whether to keep or destroy. "You're the first person who's ever made him hesitate before shouting," Petrov continued, quieter now. "I've watched him for 11 years. I've never seen it. I don't know if that makes you brave or if it makes you the most dangerous mistake this building has made in a decade. I would advise you to find out which before it decides for you." He stepped aside then, finally, and let her pass. At the bottom of the stairwell, Mara stopped and looked back up at him. "Why tell me this?" she asked. "You don't seem like a man who does favors." Petrov's face, for just a moment, lost its practiced hardness. "Because I watched his father do this to him, reward every hardness, punish every softness, until there was nothing soft left in the boy at all. And because for the first time in 11 years, I saw something in that office on Tuesday that looked almost like the beginning of a different man. I don't know if I want to see it finished or stopped. I haven't decided yet either." He turned and walked back up the stairs, leaving Mara alone with the sound of her own pulse and the growing, uncomfortable certainty that the discrepancy in the ledger was the smallest mystery in this building, not the largest. The ship's bell sat on Nikolai's desk the way a scar sits on a hand, small, easy to overlook, until someone finally asks about it and the whole story comes loose at once. Mara noticed it properly for the first time on a night she stayed late cross-referencing warehouse shift logs against the 3 names on her suspect list. The building had emptied by 9. Nikolai's door was open, which was unusual. He worked with it closed most evenings, as though the harbor view were something he didn't want witnessed. She knocked on the frame anyway, holding a page of numbers that needed his signature. He was not looking at his monitor. He was looking at the bell, one finger resting on its rim without pressing hard enough to make it ring. "My father's first boat," he said, before she'd asked. "A trawler. 22 feet, half rotted through by the time I was born." He kept the bell after he scrapped the hull. Said it was the only honest thing he ever built. Everything after that, the docks, the routes, all of it, he built with other people's fear instead of his own hands. Mara set the page down but didn't leave. "You don't talk about him. Nobody in this building talks about him. That's the point of him." Nikolai's finger finally stilled against the bell entirely. "He used to say a man who explains himself has already lost. So he never explained. He shouted, or he went silent, and both of those were supposed to mean the same thing, that arguing with him cost more than it was worth. I was 9 the first time I understood that the silence was worse than the shouting. The shouting ended. The silence didn't, not until he decided it should." "And you learned to do both," Mara said. "Not a question. I learned there wasn't a third option. Not in this house. Not in this business." He looked up at her then, and there was none of the performance in his face that she'd grown used to watching, for no temper waiting to detonate, no stillness built to intimidate. Just a tiredness that looked, for a moment, almost young. You keep waiting for me to explain myself less. I keep finding that I can't stop around you. I don't know what that means. It means you're allowed to be a person who isn't him, Mara said. Eventually. If you want to be. He didn't answer. But he didn't pick up his pen and go back to the monitor either, and for a long moment the only sound in the office was the harbor wind against the glass and the bell, unrung, between them. Mara told herself she had taken the job for the salary alone. It was easier that way, cleaner, a story with no complicated edges. But the truth sat in a folder in the bottom drawer of her desk at home, and on Saturday, when Theo called asking if she could come by, the truth came with her. Her brother lived in a one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, for years younger than Mara and permanently exhausted in the particular way of people managing a chronic illness on an income that didn't stretch to cover it. He'd been diagnosed at 22, a kidney condition that required treatment their insurance covered exactly enough of to be dangerous rather than merciful. Mara had watched him ration medication before. She had promised herself, standing in a hospital hallway 2 years ago, that she would never watch it again. You look tired, Theo said, letting her in. I look employed, Mara said, and he laughed, though it didn't quite reach the exhaustion in his eyes. She made tea while he went through the mail, insurance statements, a payment plan letter, the particular paperwork of a life balanced on a ledge. Mara had taken the Kessler logistics job because it paid nearly double what her last position had, because Nikolai's HR department, unlike every other place she'd applied, hadn't blinked at her request for a signing bonus large enough to cover Theo's overdue balance outright. She had known exactly what kind of company she was walking into. She had done the math anyway, and the math had told her that her brother's kidneys mattered more than her comfort with the source of a paycheck. You never said where you're working now, Theo said, setting the mail down. Logistics company. Downtown. It's fine. He studied her. Theo had always been better at reading her than anyone else alive, a side effect of a childhood spent watching their father's business collapse together, learning to read the weather in each other's faces before either of them said a word. Fine like a job, or fine like something you're not telling me because you don't want me to worry? Mara wrapped both hands around her mug and didn't answer right away. It's complicated, she finally said. The people I work for aren't good people, Theo. Not all of them. Maybe not any of them, depending on who you ask. But it's paying your last bill in full, and it's paying the next 6 months besides, and I found out this week I might be the only person in that building anyone's honest with. That has to be worth something. Theo reached across the small table and took her hand, the same way he had at 9 years old, watching their father sign away the last of the trucking business to a smiling man who'd turned out to be exactly as dishonest as his own numbers eventually proved. Just be careful, he said. You've never been good at being small when you should be. No, Mara agreed, thinking of a shouted word answered without flinching, of a silent bell on a desk, of a man who kept finding himself unable to stop explaining. I never have. The name arrived on a Monday, and it was worse than any of the 3 Mara had suspected. It belonged to a man named Callum Reyes, Ilse's younger cousin, hired 8 months earlier on Ilse's own recommendation, given warehouse access on Ilse's own signature. The pattern in the shipments matched his shift schedule too precisely to be coincidence. Mara sat with the finding for an entire night before bringing it forward, not out of fear of Nikolai, but because she understood exactly what the discovery would cost the one person in the building who had, in her own guarded way, started to seem like an ally. She told him on a Tuesday morning, in front of Ilse, because hiding it would have been its own kind of lie. The room went cold before anyone raised their voice. Ilse's face drained of color. She did not deny it, did not defend her cousin, only stood very still with the particular stillness of someone doing math on how much of this would land on her. Nikolai read the evidence in silence, the silence Mara now understood, thanks to a conversation about a bell, was the more dangerous of his two registers. "How long?" he said finally to Ilsa. "I didn't know," Ilsa said. "Nikolai, I swear to you I didn't." "How long?" The shout, when it came, was not the performance Mara had first mistaken it for weeks ago. It came from somewhere older than this room, older than this building, a boy who had learned that betrayal, once discovered, had to be met with enough force to make certain it never happened twice. He was on his feet before Mara realized he'd moved, his hand slamming the desk hard enough that the bell beside his monitor jumped and rang, once, sharp and startling in a room that had never heard it make a sound. "Everyone who works for me," he said, voice climbing, "everyone, is supposed to understand what it costs to lie to me." "Stop." Mara's voice cut through his, not loud, but final. The room turned toward her the way it had turned toward Nikolai a moment earlier. "Ilsa didn't lie to you. She vouched for someone 8 months ago who turned out not to deserve it. That's not betrayal, Nikolai. That's what happens when you trust people, which you almost never do, and which is exactly why nobody in this building has told you the truth in years except me." His jaw was tight, chest still rising too fast, the bell settling back into stillness beside him. "You don't understand what happens to people who steal from this family. I understand you're about to make a decision you can't undo, in front of the one person who's actually stayed loyal to you this whole time, because you're too angry right now to tell the difference between the person who stole and the person standing next to her." Mara held his gaze and did not look away, the way she never looked away. "You told me once your father never explained himself. You explained plenty when you let yourself. Don't stop now on the one decision that actually matters." The silence that followed was the longest one yet. Ilsa had not moved, had not breathed, watching the two of them the way a person watches a verdict being decided that will determine the rest of her life. Nikolai sat back down. It was such a small motion, and it changed everything in the room at once, Ilsa's shoulders dropping half an inch, the air finally moving again, the bell going quiet on the desk between them. "Bring Callum to me," Nikolai said, and his voice had leveled out into something colder and more controlled, which Mara understood now was not calm exactly, but a kind of discipline he was choosing in real time, in front of her, instead of the reflex his father had trained into him. "Not tonight. Tomorrow, when I'm not still deciding whether I trust myself in a room with him. Ilsa, you're not the reason this happened. You're the reason we caught it before it became something worse." Ilsa's composure finally broke, just slightly, at the corner of her eyes. "I recommended him," she said. "I put my name on it." "You put your name on a lot of things that turned out fine," Nikolai said. "This is the first one that didn't. That's not a pattern. That's bad luck with someone you trusted." He glanced at Mara, something unreadable passing over his face. "I'm told that's the difference between betrayal and misplaced trust. I'm still learning it." After Ilsa left, steadier than she'd entered, though she did not look at Mara on her way out, not quite ready yet to know what to do with what had just happened, Nikolai remained at his desk, the bell within reach of his hand. "You could have let me do it my way," he said. "Nobody would have questioned it. It's what everyone in this building expects from me." "I know," Mara said. "That's why I didn't let you." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face had shifted permanently since the morning of her interview. The stillness that had once seemed like intimidation now looked, to her, like a man finally choosing what to do with the quiet instead of using it as a weapon. "Petrov thinks you're either the bravest person in this building or the most dangerous mistake I've made in years. What do you think?" "I think," Nikolai said slowly, "that I've spent 11 years running this place exactly like my father did, because I never believed there was another way to keep it standing. You're the first person who's made me wonder if I was wrong." He reached out and, for the first time since Mara had started working there, rang the bell, a single, deliberate note, clear and unhidden. "I don't know what that's worth yet. but I intend to find out." Callum Reyes did not deny it. He sat across from Nikolai's desk the next afternoon with the particular blankness of a man who has already accepted whatever is coming, and when Nikolai asked him why, the answer was smaller and sadder than anyone in the room had braced for. "My mother's surgery," Callum said. "Ilse doesn't know. I didn't want her to know. She'd have covered the cost herself, and I've taken enough from that family already." He looked at his hands instead of at Nikolai. "I told myself I'd only take enough to cover it. Then I told myself that again the next month." "I know how that sounds." Mara, standing near the door at Nikolai's request, a presence he had started including without explanation, the way another man might have once excluded her without explanation, watched something complicated move across Nikolai's face. Not the cold calculation she'd expected. Something closer to recognition. "My father would have made an example of you," Nikolai said. Publicly. In front of the warehouse crew, so everyone understood the cost of taking what wasn't theirs. He let the words sit, watching Callum flinch at the certainty in them. "I've spent 11 years believing that was the only kind of lesson that stuck." "And now?" Callum asked, barely above a whisper. "Now I think a man desperate enough to steal from the one family who trusted him needed someone to notice before it went this far, not someone to make an example of him after." Nikolai's jaw was tight, but his voice stayed level, the discipline Mara had watched him choose in front of Ilse a week earlier holding steady again. "You'll pay back what's owed, on terms we set today, not terms you invent when you're desperate again. And you'll tell Ilse the truth yourself, not let her hear it from anyone else." "That's not mercy, Callum. That's the price of staying." Callum's shoulders dropped, something between relief and disbelief. Mara understood, watching him go. That word of this would travel through the warehouse crew by nightfall, not the story of an example made, but the story of a boss who had chosen a harder, stranger kind of discipline instead. She didn't know yet whether that story would make Nikolai safer in this business or more exposed. She suspected, from the tightness still visible in his shoulders after the door closed, that he didn't fully know either. The story did travel, exactly as Mara had guessed it would, through the warehouse, through the docks, eventually to people who had no business hearing it at all. It reached Dmitry Aldana within the week. The Aldana family had watched the Kessler organization for years the way a wolf watches an aging animal at the edge of a herd, patient, calculating, waiting for the first sign that the strength holding the territory together had begun to soften. A boss who forgave a thief instead of making an example of him was, to men like Aldana, not a story about mercy. It was a story about weakness, and weakness on the docks had a short, brutal shelf life. Nikolai heard about the meeting Aldana had called with two of the smaller shipping crews before Petrov brought him the news directly, which told Mara, watching from her desk through the half-open door, exactly how fast the ground beneath Kessler Logistics had started to shift. "They're testing you," Petrov said, without preamble, the same bluntness he'd once used to warn Mara in a stairwell. "The Reyes boy, the mercy you showed him, Aldana's people are calling it the first crack in 11 years of a wall that never had one. He's going to push. Rivals like him don't wait to see if a crack means something. They widen it before anyone can decide." Nikolai's hand found the bell on his desk, not ringing it, just resting there, a habit Mara recognized now as the shape of him thinking rather than performing. "My father would say I've already lost the territory. That mercy is a door, and once you open it, everyone who's been waiting outside walks straight through." "Is he wrong?" Petrov asked, not a challenge, a genuine question, the closest thing to uncertainty Mara had ever heard from him. Nikolai didn't answer right away. When he finally looked up, he looked first at Petrov, and then, longer, at Mara standing in the doorway she hadn't quite decided to enter. "I don't know yet," he said. "But I know what happens if I go back to the only other door I've ever known." I've watched what that door does to a man for 34 years. I'm not opening it again just because Aldana's frightened of what I might become instead. The bell stayed silent under his hand, but he did not let go of it either, holding on to the one honest thing his father had ever built, Mara thought, while trying, for the first time in his life, to build something honest of his own. Nobody had ever spoken to the Mafia boss like this. Aldana did not send a message. He sent a shipment back, 3 containers of imported steel fittings, rerouted overnight from the Kessler-controlled berth to a competing dock 2 piers down. No explanation offered, no invoice disputed. It was not theft. It was smaller and more deliberate than theft, a demonstration that he could touch what belonged to Nikolai and suffer no consequence for doing it. Mara found the rerouting in the shipping logs before anyone told her, the same way she found everything, by refusing to trust a summary when the raw numbers were still available to check herself. She brought it to Nikolai's office at 8 in the morning, before the rest of the floor had arrived, and watched him read it with the stillness that she now understood was not calm, but the discipline of a man actively choosing not to become his father in real time. He's not trying to hurt us financially, Nikolai said. 3 containers is nothing to a company our size. He's trying to see how I respond in front of people who'll talk about it by lunch. He set the page down, precisely, the way a man sets down something he does not trust himself to grip too hard. My father would already be on the phone. He'd have men at that dock within the hour, and by tonight there'd be a story everyone on the harbor would tell for the next decade about what happens to people who touch Kessler property. And if you do that, Mara said, you're not answering Aldana. You're becoming the exact thing he's betting you'll become. He wants you predictable. Predictable is easy to plan around. Nikolai looked up at her, something sharp and searching in his expression. Then what would you do? I'd let him think it worked, Mara said. For now. I'd find out exactly what he's actually testing, territory or leadership or just your temper, before I spent a single resource reacting to a message he hasn't even sent in words yet. And I'd make sure every crew on that dock understood the truth was that you chose not to react, not that you couldn't. He was quiet for a long moment, turning the ship's bell slowly under 2 fingers without ringing it. That's a harder thing to sell than a show of force. Most true things are, Mara said. That's usually how you know they're worth doing. The restraint held for 4 days, and in those 4 days, Mara watched it cost Nikolai something she hadn't fully anticipated, not weakness exactly, but a kind of exposure he had spent his whole adult life avoiding. Petrov grew tense and short-tempered, watching the crews for any sign that Aldana's stunt had shifted loyalties. Ilsa doubled the guard rotation at the 2 remaining berths without being asked, her face carrying the particular focus of someone trying to prove, after Callum, that her judgment could still be trusted. And Nikolai himself grew quieter than Mara had yet seen him, not the loaded silence of a man about to detonate, but something closer to a man holding a decision at arm's length, afraid of what it would cost him to set it down wrong. She found him on the 5th evening standing at the window instead of at his desk, the bell left untouched behind him. You think I made a mistake, he said, without turning around. I think you're scared, Mara said, and I think that scares you more than Aldana does, because you've spent your whole life being taught that fear and weakness are the same thing, and you don't know yet whether you believe that's true. He turned then. In the low evening light off the harbor, he looked less like the man who had once slammed a hand on his desk hard enough to ring a silent bell, and more like the boy Petrov had described in a stairwell weeks ago. A child raised to believe there had never been a third option beyond shouting or silence. If I'm wrong about this, he said, it isn't just my mistake. It's every person on that dock who depends on me not being wrong. Petrov's right to be tense. Ilsa's right to double the guards. I've built nothing here that could survive being wrong the way my father's methods could survive it. Fear doesn't require you to be right. It only requires you to be feared. And if you're correct, Mara said, you'll have built something that doesn't depend on fear at all. Something that survives you being human instead of requiring you not to be. She stepped closer, close enough that the harbor wind through the cracked window moved between them both. You don't have to know which one it is yet. You just have to decide which one you want it to be badly enough to find out. He looked at her for a long moment, something unguarded finally surfacing in his face, not the mask he wore for the warehouse cruise, not even the discipline he'd been practicing in front of Petrov and Ilsa, but something quieter and more uncertain than either. Nobody has ever asked me what I want this place to be, he said. Only what my father would have wanted it to remain. I'm asking, Mara said. The bell sat silent behind him, and outside, the harbor kept its own restless rhythm, indifferent to the 4 days of held breath inside the building, but for the first time since she'd walked through that door weeks ago. Mara watched Nikolai Kessler look like a man beginning, carefully, to answer a question no one had ever let him ask himself. Restraint, Aldana discovered within the week, was not the same as surrender, and he did not tolerate the confusion well. The second move came harder than the first, not a rerouted shipment this time, but 2 of Kessler's dock workers approached directly outside a bar 3 blocks from the harbor, offered money to slow their shifts, to look away at the right moments, to become small cracks in a wall that Aldana had convinced himself was already failing. One of the 2 came straight to Petrov afterward, shaken and apologetic, as if the offer itself were a betrayal he'd committed simply by hearing it. The other said nothing at all, which told Mara, cross-referencing shift logs late that night, exactly where to look for the next discrepancy before it happened. She brought the pattern to Nikolai before dawn, the harbor still dark outside his window, and this time he did not reach for the bell first. He reached for the report itself, reading it twice with the same careful stillness she'd come to recognize as his real temper, the one that didn't announce itself with volume. He's not testing my leadership anymore, Nikolai said. He's trying to buy it out from under me, one worker at a time, cheaper than it would cost him to fight for it outright. Then don't fight him for it outright either, Mara said. You match the trap he's setting instead of matching the fight he wants. Publicly raise wages for every dock worker on both berths, not as a reaction to Aldana, no mention of him at all, just as policy, effective immediately. Anyone considering his money will do the math themselves and realize loyalty to you costs Aldana more than he's willing to pay. Nikolai studied her for a long moment. My father would call that buying loyalty instead of earning it through fear. Your father's men still took Aldana's money the second his back was turned, Mara said. Fear buys obedience while you're watching. It's never once bought loyalty when you weren't. Something settled in his face, not quite a smile, but the particular quiet of a man recognizing an answer he should have reached years earlier, if anyone had ever given him permission to look for one. Draft it, he said. Today. And put your name on the memo alongside mine. I want the crews to know exactly whose judgment convinced me. The wage increase went out by noon, unremarkable in its wording, entirely deliberate in its timing. By the following evening, word had reached Nikolai through Petrov that the second dock worker, the one who'd said nothing, had quietly declined Aldana's second approach, citing, almost word for word, the new terms posted at both berths. It should have felt like a victory, clean and complete. It didn't, not fully, and Mara understood why the moment she saw Petrov's face at the following morning's meeting, tight, unsettled. The look of a man watching a method succeed that contradicted everything he had spent 30 years believing about how loyalty was built and kept. It worked, Petrov said, in the tone of someone confessing something reluctantly. I don't understand how it worked, but it worked. Men who would have taken Aldana's money without blinking a year ago are turning it down over a wage increase and a memo with her name on it. He looked at Mara, and for the first time since the stairwell warning weeks earlier, there was no wariness in it, only a kind of grudging, complicated respect. I spent 11 years thinking there was only one way to keep this operation standing. I'm having to consider, for the first time in my life, that I might have been protecting the wrong lesson the whole time. You were protecting the only lesson you were ever taught, Nikolai said. That's not the same as being wrong for believing it. It's just time we found out if there's a better one. Ilsa, standing near the window with the particular steadiness she'd carried since Callum's reckoning, spoke for the first time. Aldana isn't finished. Men like him don't walk away from a failed test. They escalate until something breaks or they run out of moves. This bought us loyalty. It didn't buy us safety. No, Nikolai agreed, and Mara watched him say it without flinching, without reaching for the bell, without any of the old instinct to answer uncertainty with volume. It didn't. But it bought us a crew that will still be standing beside us when whatever comes next actually arrives. My father built an empire that stood only as long as fear held it together. I'd rather build something smaller that survives being tested, because for the first time since I took this desk, I actually believe it will. Outside, the harbor moved through its restless gray rhythm, indifferent as always to what was being decided inside the building above it, but inside, for the first time in the story Mara had watched unfold since the morning of her interview, the room held something steadier than fear. It held, however fragile and untested, the early shape of trust. Aldana's third move arrived without any of the careful deniability of the first two. It arrived as a warning left deliberately where it would be found, the warehouse's rear entrance door, standing open at dawn, its lock cut clean rather than forced, nothing taken, nothing damaged, only a message left in the emptiest possible language. I can reach whatever I want, whenever I choose to. Petrov found it first and called Nikolai before he called anyone else, and by the time Mara arrived, the whole floor had gathered in a silence that felt entirely different from the fierce silence she'd learned to read in her first weeks. This was something closer to held breath before a storm everyone could already see arriving. He's not testing anymore, Ilsa said, arms crossed, jaw tight. This is a statement. He wants you to know he could have taken something. He wants you to spend the next month wondering what and when. Nikolai stood at the cut lock for a long moment, and Mara watched the old instinct move visibly across his face, the one that wanted volume. Wanted an immediate and violent answer loud enough to silence the question Aldana had just asked the entire waterfront. She watched him choose, deliberately, not to reach for it. He wants me frightened enough to make a mistake, Nikolai said instead. The kind of mistake that gives him a real reason to move against me instead of just an excuse. He turned to Petrov. Full security review at both berths, effective today, cameras, rotations, everything you've been wanting to change since I took this desk and never had the authority to push through against my father's old methods. You have it now. Petrov's eyebrows rose slightly, some old, permanent wariness in him finally softening into something like relief. You're taking this seriously. I'm taking it seriously without becoming him, Nikolai said. There's a difference. I intend to keep finding it, even now. But that night, alone with Mara over the warehouse's security footage, replaying the empty hours around the cut lock for anything the cameras might have missed, his composure finally cracked not into anger, but into something rawer than she'd yet seen from him. If he'd taken something, he said quietly, staring at a frozen frame of an empty hallway. If he'd taken someone. A worker. You. His hand tightened on the edge of the desk. I don't know if I could have stayed the man I've been trying to become for the last 2 months. I don't know if that man survives losing something that actually matters. Mara didn't answer right away. She sat with the weight of what he'd said, the admission underneath it, larger than the sentence itself, and thought of her father, standing in a doorway years ago. Watching his own trucking company get taken apart by men who understood exactly how to exploit decency without ever breaking a law loud enough to be punished for it. My father lost everything to a man like Aldana, she finally said. Not through violence. Through patience. Through knowing exactly how far decency could be pushed before it broke, and pushing exactly that far, over and over, until there was nothing left to push against. She looked at Nikolai directly. He never became a harder man to survive it. He became a smaller one. I watched it happen for years before I understood what I was watching. And you think I'm at risk of the same thing, Nikolai said. Becoming smaller instead of harder. I think you're at risk of believing there are only two shapes a person can take when they're frightened enough, Mara said. Harder, like your father. Smaller, like mine. I don't think either one is true. I think the last 2 months have been you finding out there's a third shape nobody ever showed you existed, and I think that's exactly why Aldana is frightened enough to escalate. Men like him understand hardness. They understand fear. They don't know what to do with someone choosing something else entirely, and it terrifies them more than either of the shapes they already know how to fight. Nikolai was quiet for a long time, the frozen security footage still glowing faintly on the screen between them. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost the rawness from moments before, settling into something steadier, more deliberate. Whatever happens with Aldana, he said, whatever this costs, I don't want to go back to being the only other version of myself I know how to be. Even if this version is more dangerous. Even if it gets tested harder than the one my father built ever was. He looked at her, and there was nothing guarded left in his expression at all. I need you to understand that before whatever's coming actually arrives. I'm not choosing this because it's safe. I'm choosing it because it's the first thing in 11 years that's felt like it was actually mine. Outside, the harbor moved through the last hour before dawn, dark water beneath a darker sky, indifferent as ever to the two people sitting inside a lit office above it, but between them, something had shifted permanently, past the point where either of them could pretend it hadn't. Whatever Aldana intended to bring to the docks in the days ahead, Nikolai Kessler had already made the harder decision, the one his father had never once required of him. He had chosen, deliberately and with open eyes, exactly what kind of man he wanted to be found as, whether or not he survived being tested for it. Aldana requested the meeting himself, which told Nikolai more than any warning left at a cut lock ever could have. Men confident in their advantage rarely asked to sit across a table from the person they intended to destroy. They simply proceeded. A request meant Aldana had run every quiet option he had, and had not gotten the reaction he needed from any of them. They met at neutral ground, a shipping office 2 piers down, chosen by neither party, watched by both. Nikolai brought Petrov and Ilsa. He also, after a long silence in his office the night before, asked Mara to come, not as a bodyguard or a negotiator, but because, he told her, he no longer trusted his own read of a room the way he trusted hers. Dmitry Aldana was smaller than his reputation, gray-haired, precise in his movements, a man who had built his own version of power on patience rather than volume. He did not raise his voice once during the entire meeting, which Mara understood immediately was its own kind of warning. A man that controlled did not need to perform anger to be dangerous. You've made some interesting decisions these past months, Aldana said, once the pleasantries had been exhausted. Mercy for a thief. A wage increase instead of a message. Restraint, where your father would have answered immediately. He folded his hands on the table. I want to understand what I'm dealing with before I decide how much further this needs to go. You're dealing with someone who isn't interested in a war that costs both our organizations more than either of us can afford to lose, Nikolai said. Not because I'm afraid of one. Because I've learned, recently, that there's a difference between strength and volume, and I intend to run this territory on the first one from now on. Aldana's gaze moved, deliberately, to Mara. And the woman. Your bookkeeper, I'm told. The one whose name is on the wage memo that's apparently costing me workers I paid good money to compromise. Something almost amused crossed his face. I've run this business for 20 years, Mr. Kessler. I've never once seen a man in your position let someone outside the family speak for him in a room like this. She's not speaking for me, Nikolai said. She's the reason I finally learned how to speak for myself. The silence that followed held longer than any Mara had sat through since the morning of her interview. Aldana studied Nikolai with the particular focus of a man recalculating an equation he had been certain he'd already solved. I came here expecting either a frightened boy still finding his footing in his father's shadow, Aldana finally said, or an angry one, reckless enough to give me the excuse I needed to move against him properly. I did not come here expecting whatever this is. He gestured faintly at the room, at Petrov's steady watchfulness, at Ilsa's composed readiness, at Mara sitting where no outsider had ever been permitted to sit in a meeting like this. You've built something I don't fully understand yet. That makes you harder to plan around than either version I was prepared for. That was the point, Nikolai said. Aldana was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, something had shifted in his tone, not surrender, but the recalculation of a man who understood, better than most, when a fight had stopped being worth its cost. I'll be honest with you, Mr. Kessler, since you've apparently decided honesty is worth something now. I tested you because a soft leader is an easy target, and easy targets get taken by someone if not by me. I don't yet believe you're soft. I believe you're something I haven't encountered before, and until I understand it, moving against you is a risk I'm not prepared to take for 3 containers of steel fittings and a cut lock. Then we're finished here, Nikolai said. For now, Aldana said, rising. He paused before the door, looking back at Mara one final time. Whatever you are to him, advisor, conscience, whatever word he hasn't found yet, you should understand what you've built. Men like his father held territory through fear for decades, and it never once made them safe, only feared, which men like me eventually stopped being able to tell apart from weak. What you've built him into today, I can't yet predict how to break. That should frighten you as much as it frightens me. It usually means someone's about to try harder to find out. He left without another word. The office held its silence for a long moment after the door closed, until Petrov finally exhaled, the tension of the last 2 months visibly loosening from his shoulders for the first time. He's not finished, Petrov said. Men like Aldana never walk away for good. But he's not moving against us today, and today, given where we started, is more than I thought we'd win. Nikolai turned to Mara, and there was something in his face that hadn't been there at the start of the meeting, not relief exactly, but a kind of quiet, hard-won certainty. You told me once there was a third option my father never showed me, he said. I don't think I understood, until just now, watching a man like Aldana try and fail to find the shape of it, exactly how right you were. Winter arrived on the harbor the way it always did, early, gray, unhurried, and Kessler Logistics settled into a rhythm Mara had never expected to see in a building she'd once walked into holding her breath like everyone else. Callum had repaid what he owed, on schedule, and stayed on at the warehouse with a caution in his work that read less like fear now and more like gratitude he didn't quite know how to voice out loud. Ilsa had taken on a role she'd never held before, not second in command in name only, but genuinely trusted with decisions Nikolai would once have made entirely alone. A trust she guarded now with a fierceness that told Mara exactly how much Callum's near catastrophe had taught her. Petrov still grumbled about half the changes made since Mara's first week, but he had stopped calling them mistakes, and twice now Mara had caught him defending the wage increase to skeptical crew leaders from other companies, using arguments that sounded suspiciously like her own. Theo's treatment continued uninterrupted, funded and secure, and on the Sunday Mara brought him to see the harbor for the first time since she'd started the job. He looked out at the gray water and said, quietly, that he finally understood why she'd never come home looking as frightened as he'd braced himself for. "You look like someone who found a place that needed exactly what she had to offer," he said. "I didn't expect that. Not from a company with a reputation like this one." "Neither did I," Mara admitted. She found Nikolai that evening in his office, the ship's bell sitting where it always had, though its silence had changed meaning entirely since the morning she'd first noticed it. He was not looking at the harbor. He was looking at a stack of proposals for the coming year, legitimate contracts, diversified shipping routes, the slow, deliberate work of building something that no longer depended on fear to hold itself together. "My father would not recognize this company," he said, without looking up. "Would that bother you?" Mara asked. He considered it for a long moment, then reached out and rang the bell, not sharply, not as a reaction to anger or crisis, but slowly, deliberately, the way a person rings a bell simply to hear that it still works. "I used to think that question would break something in me. It doesn't anymore." I think he built the only thing he knew how to build, and it was smaller than what it could have been, because fear is always smaller than the alternative, even when it's louder. He looked up at her. "I don't think it would bother him, not recognizing this place. I think it might be the only thing he ever built that actually deserved to outlast him." There was no single moment where everything resolved, no dramatic reversal, no final confrontation larger than the ones already survived. It arrived instead the way real change usually does, in the accumulation of small, unremarkable Tuesdays where nobody in the building held their breath anymore when Nikolai's door opened. Mara stayed. Not because the fear had disappeared entirely. She understood, better than anyone in that building, that the world Nikolai operated in would never be fully safe. That Aldana's warning about trying harder to break what they'd built remained a shadow at the edge of every quiet season, but because she had found, in the space of a few unlikely months, something she hadn't known she was looking for when she walked into that lobby holding a folder she'd rewritten 4 times, a place where telling the truth, even to the most feared man on the docks, had turned out to be the most valuable thing she owned. Nikolai never fully stopped being the man capable of the stillness that had once made grown men go quiet in his presence. That part of him, Mara understood, was not a flaw to be corrected but a strength that had simply needed a better use than fear, and she watched him find that use, slowly, in every decision that followed the wage increase. Every negotiation handled without a raised voice, every moment he chose the harder, quieter answer instead of the loud one his father would have reached for instinctively. On the last evening of that first winter, Mara found him standing at the window again, the bell silent behind him, the harbor dark and steady under a sky finally clear of rain. 11 years, he said. I thought there were only 2 ways to survive in this building. I spent every one of them exhausted by both. He turned to look at her, and there was nothing guarded left in his face at all, no performance, no calculation, only the plain, unhidden fact of a man who had finally stopped needing either shouting or silence to hold his ground. You never once raised your voice at me. Not that first morning, not any morning since. I keep trying to understand how something that quiet turned out to be the loudest thing anyone's ever said to me. Maybe it's not about volume, Mara said. Maybe it never was. Outside, the harbor kept its old, indifferent rhythm, the way it always had and always would, unconcerned with the small, unlikely victory unfolding in the lit office above it. A boy who had learned there were only 2 shapes fear could take, discovering, finally, a third one nobody had ever shown him. Not louder. Not smaller. Simply, at last, entirely his own.